Okay, that's perfect then. So thanks very much. And yes, indeed, this is a very complex topic to try and cover in 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. I've obviously got a very particular lens on this that would be that leaves out many of the other perhaps very important aspects. But let me give it my best. We'll try and get our heads around these 30 years of post-apartheid evolution in housing policy, and that is a very complex picture. And then just we'd like to go beyond those historical facts to think through intersectionality and the liberal economic policy kind of implications in all of this. And I think particularly for this webinar, we would then also want to consider or think through considerations for activism. Mercy, will you give me something like a little sign when it's 2 minutes?
I'll do that.
From my time being up. Okay. Moving to the slide. Sorry, let me just move this a little bit. There we go. At least I can see the screen fully. So the housing, it is now really 3 decades, and in a way these decades have been marked. So that 1994 we had our white paper on housing. In 2004, that historic moment of the first decade, the breaking new ground. It was the comprehensive program for the sustainable comprehensive plan for the development of sustainable human settlements, and with that, already an attempt to shift away from housing to something vague called human settlements. A decade later, but in 2014, there were already deliberations underway for a new white paper. These have been very drawn out and very hard, I think, for the relevant officials to bring to any closure or point where this could be adopted. We're now in 2024, a decade later, and we do have a draft white paper that's been through cabinet, that has been out for comment, and that the current minister is hoping to get approved by cabinet before the elections. In fact, in this month, yeah. Okay, so we're going to try and populate this timeline, and I'm starting here with this first decade, which was a very intense decade of policy development. The project-linked and consolidation subsidies were brought on board first, and the project-linked subsidy is the housing subsidy that later came to be known as the Reconstruction and Development Program, RDP, housing subsidy. It was never called that officially, and in a way, as the ANC's election manifesto called RDP, and initially up till 1996, given a lot of emphasis by the new government, as that waned, that commitment to those undertakings waned, the project-linked housing subsidy somehow remained the last hope that society had in the RDP, and it referred, in some ways they were called Mandela houses, but they were also called RDP houses as a remembrance of that RDP, but it definitely isn't that policy isn't represented in those houses. I think that's an important distinction to be made. Institutional housing subsidy and individual housing subsidies were added. The people's housing process was added in 98. We saw a national housing code, which was actually a requirement. It was put together in 2000, and to it subsequently were still some programs were added. Emergency housing program 2003, and an informal settlements upgrading program in 2004. The National Housing Code was then repackaged in 2009, and this was following the BNG Breaking New Ground plan, which had brought new policies and a new emphasis into housing policy, the time, perhaps that code should already have been called the Human Settlements Code. It would have taken a little bit of pressure off the current assumption that we need to revise all of this to call everything human settlements rather than housing. Interesting that this seminar is recentering on housing. So it's an argument I've been making in the white paper deliberations now, is that we shouldn't forget how complex housing itself is, and getting that right while also trying to meet the requirements of sustainable human settlements. Okay, so if we move then to the next slide, yes, so the National Housing Code in 2009. Then very importantly, against all of this is the backdrop of legislative development. And of course, in 1996, the Housing Constitution, with very importantly for this sector, stating that there's a right to housing. And I think most of us will know the content of that. The Housing Act in 1997, leading out of the Constitution, although also the Housing White Paper had already been agreed upon before the Constitution, so there's some tension there. The Rental Housing Act coming later. I haven't plotted all the acts, but just to show that there's been a lot of work in the sector around developing the legislative framework required. 2008, another sort of two legislations coming out, the Social Housing Act and the Housing Development Agency Act. Then I think with this addition onto the slide, I'd like to represent this this moment from 2000 to 2004. Really, so very importantly, by 2001, this promise that was in the RDP of building 1 million houses, and which politically was kind of made to read 1 million houses in 7 years, this promise was delivered or achieved in 2001. But it also allowed that to be a moment where some things could be adjusted. And this related to various concerns that came out of these first 10 years, which were also intense in terms of housing discussion, housing debates, housing evaluations being made. Although Minister Sanki Mthembu had said time for policy making is past. We're now, it's now time for implementation. Actually, it was only around by 2000 that kind of changes were even being entertained. So one significant change that is now even in the white paper discussions as one of the things that needs to be undone is that there was an 8-year restriction placed on the sale of fully subsidized houses, which means you're stuck with that house for 8 years. You're not allowed to sell it. Of course, many of them have been sold informally, which has created other problems. But also with that sale of, with that restriction, with a little bit of a contradiction with the whole idea that people would be, people receiving a house would have, would access the market with its supposed benefits of being able to move up a ladder. Housing, the size of housing was increased from what was initially 15 square meters to 30 square meters. That was quite an important change that was made, but not really followed with a necessary budgetary shift. And it meant compromises were made in some aspects of the quality of the house. The houses were kind of squashed in a way, warped to be the right size, but not necessarily of better quality. And the introduction also of a cash contribution. So there was concern over how people had been using this gift that they'd received, and whether they were actually deserving of it, whether they were owning and appreciating it, and shouldn't they rather make a contribution? And that had implications that I won't go into now. But that was an important moment actually for sort of a start of a shift, a discomfort with that policy. Then
2 more minutes, Marie. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, okay. Okay. A whole lot of grants were developed around in the more recent years, which also were a significant change in that housing funding was always going via the province and was now going directly to municipalities. These are little moments of activism, huge activism around 1994 with leading into the white paper, some activism around the people's housing process. Some of you might have been involved in that. There was some activism around the moment of breaking new ground. What I've put on here is the Grootboom judgment and what was an increase from that moment onwards of housing rights activism and some tapering of that, tapering also of appetite in the Constitutional Court to take on socioeconomic rights. So I want to leave this picture up here for us as I take us through some thoughts beyond just this map of historical facts. So housing policy and its dominant programs are not only facts of our post-apartheid history, but their intersectionality has shaped our history in important ways. And we can talk of how it has shaped the spatial history, the material history, and the lived history, which is actually a political history. And we have to remind ourselves that the political compromises that underpinned that there were political compromises that underpinned post-apartheid policies. So with the making of right back even the housing white paper, we must recall the power of liberal corporate demands that countered a conscientized mass grassroots demand for non-commodified housing, and with this, the demand for a people-centered development of housing. And those were very important demands that have somehow petered out and are not being carried in any systematic way by grassroots, although one sees them in the demands that Abashlali Basunjandolo makes, for instance. We have to understand the systematic logic of the liberal economic doctrine and that it continues as a thread in South African housing policy throughout these 30 years. And while this doctrine has its roots way back in the 18th century, it has remained the same, but merely its instruments have changed. And South African housing policy has strengthened this doctrine's foothold on urban South Africa. Housing policy, of course, hasn't done that on its own, and it was bolstered by other policies. But what is this logic? So Alberts and Christiansen say that this particular logic is that economies depend on the constant growth in the housing market, and this privileges housing that contributes to that growth, and it marginalizes housing and that is dead in this drive. And this produces haves and have-nots, and it also has spatial expressions. So it has spatial expressions as to what kind of housing is approved in which parts of town, and it has really peripheralized low-income housing. So and it has peripheralized the ability of communities to occupy and successfully occupy well-located land. So the nature of housing policy implementation in shaping fixed interventions. We have to remember that housing policy, the interventions of housing policy in all of this is incredibly important because it's fixed interventions, which means these policies have articulated cities in ways that continue to shape not only individual lives, but society as a whole, including the economy, and in important ways also politics and political rhetoric, and also political strategy. The literature also tells us that housing fixes unsustainable consumption and locks people into particular ways of contributing, for instance, to climate change. So I'm looking forward to that next presentation. My time is up. So I just wanted to contribute these kind of thoughts to a discussion about that we'll have later on about where activism in housing needs to go and what direction it needs to take. So thanks very much.